If your money sits in a bank earning 2%, while inflation is running at 6%, you're losing 4% of your wealth every single year. Every year. Not because you're bad with money and not because you made a mistake, but because this is how the system is designed to work. This loss has a name. It's called inflation, and it's the quietest tax ever created. If someone openly took 4% of your paycheck, you'd notice immediately. You'd feel it. You'd be angry. You'd demand an explanation. But inflation doesn't work like that. It doesn't take money directly from your hands. Instead, it slowly takes value from the time you spend earning it, and that difference matters more than most people realize. The human brain reacts strongly to losses it can see. Watching money disappear hurts. Inflation is different. It's gradual, abstract, spread out over time, and that's exactly why it's so effective. You never see inflation listed on your paycheck. There's no bill in the mail, no announcement explaining what just happened, and no clear moment when you're told you're poorer than before. You only notice the symptoms later. Groceries cost a little more than they used to. Rent goes up again. Gas takes a bigger bite out of your income. And somehow, even though you're working just as hard as before, you always feel slightly behind. That isn't bad luck. And it isn't coincidence. It's policy. Inflation is often described as rising prices, but prices are just the symptom. The real issue is that inflation quietly shrinks money itself. The number in your bank account might stay the same, but what that number can actually buy slowly fades away. While most people feel confused by this process, something else is happening in the background. Inflation doesn't destroy value. It moves it. Value flows from people who save to people who borrow, from workers paid in wages to institutions that create debt, and from those who trust cash to those who own assets. If you hold cash, inflation quietly works against you. If you owe money, inflation often works in your favor. And if you own assets, real estate, stocks, scarce resources, inflation can reward you. That's why inflation feels unfair, because it is. Now ask yourself why governments would choose inflation instead of openly raising taxes. Raising taxes is loud. It creates backlash. People notice, people complain, and people vote. Inflation is different. It spreads the cost slowly across millions of people over months and years until no one can point to a single moment when it happened. By the time most people realize what's going on, the transfer is already complete. This isn't theory. It's been tested for thousands of years. In ancient Rome, soldiers were paid with silver coins trusted across the empire. Those coins had value because they contained real silver. But wars were expensive, and leaders faced a choice: raise taxes and risk revolt, or quietly reduce the silver inside the coins. They chose the quiet option. The coins looked the same. The stamp didn't change, but the value did. At first, almost no one noticed. Then prices rose, trust eroded, and trade began to break down. Rome never announced a tax increase. It simply debased its money, and every citizen paid the cost without being asked. Rome fell, but the method survived. Centuries later, revolutionary France tried a similar approach with paper money. It looked modern and innovative at first, until the printing didn't stop and confidence collapsed. Savings disappeared, bread riots followed. Once again, inflation did the work quietly. Then came Weimar Germany. After World War I, money lost value by the hour. Workers were paid twice a day just to keep up. A loaf of bread cost billions, and a lifetime of savings was erased. At that point, inflation was no longer hidden. It became confiscation. And here's the uncomfortable lesson governments learned. Not that inflation is dangerous, but that inflation is powerful. When governments borrow, spend, and print money, they repay old debts with weaker currency. Their obligations shrink, creditors suffer, savers suffer, and the state survives. That's why people don't march in the streets over inflation the way they do over taxes. Inflation feels confusing, diffuse, and hard to pin down. You don't receive an inflation bill. You just notice that life costs more. The British Empire understood this well. During both world wars, inflation quietly helped finance massive campaigns. Prices rose slowly, citizens absorbed the cost, and victory was celebrated while savings quietly lost value. The 20th century repeated this pattern again and again. In the United States, inflation helped erode debt after World War II. Politicians called it growth, but much of it was simply shrinking obligations through rising prices. Then in 1971, the final restraint disappeared when the dollar was cut loose from gold. From that moment on, inflation became normal. Now look at your own life. If your savings earn 1% while inflation runs at 5%, you're not standing still. You're moving backward 4% at a time. That value doesn't vanish. It transfers to borrowers, to governments, and to asset holders whose wealth rises while cash weakens. The 1970s made this impossible to ignore. Inflation surged, savings melted, and interest rates had to be pushed brutally high to stop it. The cure worked, but it came at a severe cost. And still, one lesson remained clear. Inflation is always paid for by ordinary people. Governments love inflation because it works quietly, but they fear it when it grows too large and becomes impossible to ignore. That's why inflation is constantly softened, redefined, and explained away. Ask yourself this. If your grocery bill doubles over a decade while official inflation is reported at 2% a year, who benefits from that gap? In 2008, inflation took a new form. Trillions were created to save financial markets, assets soared, and savers paid the price. Then in 2020, money creation reached historic levels. For a moment, it felt painless, almost magical. But there is no free lunch. By 2021 and 2022, inflation returned. Energy costs rose, food prices climbed, and housing slipped out of reach for millions. Once again, those with assets benefited, those without paid. This pattern is global. Different countries, different leaders, same mechanism. Some economists call this healthy inflation. They say 2% is good for the economy, but even slow inflation means your savings are quietly melting in the background. The difference isn't whether inflation exists, it's how fast it works. History shows who survives. Those who understand inflation adapt. Those who rely on cash fall behind. And despite the damage, governments will keep using inflation because the alternative, openly raising taxes, is politically dangerous. No politician wants to say, "We're taking more of your paycheck." It's far easier to let inflation do the job quietly. You'll be told inflation is temporary, that it's under control, and that it's necessary. New terms will be invented to make it sound technical rather than personal. But the reality doesn't change. Inflation is a tax, the oldest, the most effective, and the most unfair tax in human history. So the next time prices rise and politicians shrug, remember this. It's not an accident. It's not a mystery. It's a policy, and you're the one who pays.